The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the hills when Thomas Reed turned his car onto Route 14, a quiet two-lane highway that curved through a string of small towns. It was a clear day, the kind that made driving peaceful. No rush, no traffic, just the hum of the engine and the open road. Thomas wasn't in a hurry. He rarely was. Years of working in federal service had trained him to value stillness over speed. His grey sedan was unmarked, his suit jacket neatly folded on the passenger seat beside a worn leather briefcase. He'd been traveling back from a field briefing 2 states over, heading home after a long week. His badge and credentials were in the briefcase, tucked beneath some files. He didn't need them now. He was off duty, at least officially. As he approached a small town exit, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, a patrol car. He glanced down at his speedometer, 55, the posted limit. He signaled, slowed, and pulled to the shoulder. The patrol car followed. Thomas rolled down his window, resting his hands on the steering wheel. The air outside carried the faint scent of pine and hot asphalt. The officer approached, mid-30s, crisp uniform, mirrored sunglasses. He stopped beside the window. "Afternoon, sir." "License and registration, please," Thomas nodded. "Of course." He handed them over calmly. The officer studied the ID for a moment. "Mr. Reed, you're a long way from D.C. "Work trip," Thomas said simply. "Mind telling me what kind of work?" "Administrative," Thomas replied, his voice even. The officer's tone sharpened. "You in sales?" "Government." "Something else?" Thomas offered a small smile. "Something else." The officer tilted his head slightly, unsatisfied. "You were driving fine, but you slowed down when you saw me. That's usually what people do when they've got something to hide." Thomas met his gaze. "Or when they want to follow the law." For a moment, neither spoke. A faint breeze rustled the trees lining the road. The officer glanced toward the back seat. "Mind if I ask what's in the briefcase?" "Work files," Thomas said. "Would you open it for me?" Thomas paused. "Is there a reason?" "Just being thorough," the officer said. Thomas stayed calm. "I respect that. But I'd prefer not to open my work materials without cause." The officer frowned. "You refusing a lawful order?" "I'm asking for a lawful reason," Thomas replied gently. There was no defiance in his voice, just quiet confidence, the kind that comes from someone who's been trained to stay composed no matter the situation. The officer took a step back, his expression tight. "Stay in the vehicle," he said, walking toward his patrol car. Thomas exhaled slowly, resting both hands back on the wheel. He'd had countless encounters like this over the years, not confrontations, just moments where assumptions filled the silence before facts could. He could have ended it easily. A flash of his badge, a single sentence. But he didn't. Not yet. Because sometimes, he believed, the lesson mattered more than the convenience. 10 minutes passed before the officer returned. "Mr. Reed," he said, "do you know your vehicle matches the description of one involved in an earlier incident?" Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly. "What kind of incident?" The officer hesitated. "Suspicious activity. Someone reported a dark sedan parked near the rail yard outside town." "I see," Thomas said evenly. "And do you believe I'm connected to that?" "Just checking all possibilities," the officer said. Thomas nodded once. "That's fair." The officer's tone softened a little. "Look, I'm not trying to give you a hard time. Just doing my job." "I understand," Thomas said. "That's all any of us can do." The officer looked at him curiously. "You sound like someone who's been on the other side of this conversation before." Thomas gave a small, knowing smile. "A few times." Something in his calm unsettled the officer. "It wasn't arrogance, it was patience." "Wait here," the officer said again, heading back toward his car. Thomas watched him go, then reached for his coffee and the cup holder. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was simply waiting for the right moment. 5 minutes later, another car pulled up, an unmarked black sedan. 2 men in suits stepped out. The first walked straight toward Thomas's window. The officer froze mid-step as the suited man flashed a badge. "Director Reed," the man said briskly, "we were told you might be driving through this area. We've been tracking your route for security clearance." The officer's head snapped toward Thomas. "Director?" Thomas looked up, his tone calm and quiet. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The second agent handed the stunned officer a sealed folder. "Next time, Call in your stop before questioning a federal director, officer. You're dismissed. The officer's face went pale. Sir, I didn't know, Thomas interrupted softly. No, you didn't. He stepped out of the car, standing tall but composed. But now you do, the officer swallowed. Sir, I was just doing your job, Thomas said, finishing the sentence for him. I know. He reached into his jacket and handed the officer his own business card. Simple, embossed with the FBI seal. Next time you stop someone, Thomas said quietly, remember, authority isn't a mirror. It's a responsibility. Then he nodded to his agents and got back into his car. As he drove away, the flashing lights faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by the reflection of his own calm expression. Some lessons, he thought, don't need punishment. Just awareness, and awareness, and when earned, stays. 3 days after the traffic stop, Officer Daniel Hayes sat at his desk in the small-town precinct, a cup of cold coffee untouched beside him. The incident report sat open on his screen, short, procedural, nothing out of order. Yet he kept rereading it, each sentence echoing the same truth. He'd stopped the FBI director. No one had reprimanded him. There had been no formal complaint, no official statement. Still, the chief had called him in that morning. Hayes, the chief said, leaning back in his chair, you've got a clean record. You've done good work. But what happened the other day? That's not the kind of attention we want, Daniel nodded. Understood, sir. The Bureau reached out, the chief added. They said Director Reed doesn't want any disciplinary action. Apparently he told them you were professional under pressure. Daniel blinked. He said that? The chief smirked faintly. Yeah, that man's got more patience than most. He closed the folder on his desk. They also said he wants to meet you. Daniel frowned. Meet me? Why? Didn't say, but he's coming down tomorrow morning. 700. Daniel nodded, his chest tightening. Yes, sir. The chief paused, his tone softening. For what it's worth, Hayes, I don't think he's coming to chew you out. I think he's coming to teach you something. The next morning, the station was unusually quiet. Officers moved briskly but spoke in low tones, aware that someone important was coming. At 8:58, a black SUV pulled up outside. When Thomas Reed stepped out, dressed in a dark suit and coat, the air seemed to shift, not because of authority, but because of presence. He didn't walk like a man trying to prove anything. He walked like a man who already had. He entered the precinct, greeting the receptionist with a calm good morning. When Daniel saw him, he stood immediately. Director Reed, sir. Officer Hayes, Thomas said, shaking his hand. Thank you for taking the time. Of course, Daniel replied, unsure what else to say. Let's talk somewhere quiet, Thomas said. They stepped into the small briefing room. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting thin lines of light across the table. Thomas sat folding his hands. I wanted to meet you because I believe conversations teach more than consequences. Daniel nodded slowly. I appreciate that, sir. Thomas smiled slightly. Do you remember what I told you after the stop? Daniel hesitated. Yes, you said authority isn't a mirror, it's a responsibility. Thomas nodded. And do you know what that means? Daniel took a moment before answering. I think it means our badge isn't about proving who we are. It's about protecting others, even when we don't understand them. Thomas leaned back. That's a good start. He paused, then asked softly, when you saw me that day, what did you assume? Daniel's jaw tightened. Honestly, sir? I thought you might have been hiding something. You looked calm, too calm. Most people get nervous when they're pulled over. Thomas's eyes met his. And did that calm make me suspicious? Daniel sighed. It shouldn't have. No, Thomas said gently. But I understand why it did. You're trained to read people, to look for signs. The danger isn't in reading. It's in forgetting that the book might be different than the cover suggests. Daniel nodded, absorbing every word. Thomas continued, I've worked with officers my entire career. Good ones, honest ones, the kind who save lives by trusting their instincts. But instincts are only as good as the respect behind them. Without that, they turn into habits, and habits can blind you. Daniel exhaled slowly. You're right, Thomas smiled faintly. You're young, Hayes. You've got time to be better than your habits. He reached into his coat and placed a small black notebook on the table. This is a field journal from one of my early years. I kept it to remind myself of every mistake I made in judgment. Every time I was too quick to assume, too slow to listen. Daniel looked at it, surprised. "You're giving it to me?" "I'm lending it," Thomas said. "Read it. You'll see that even the director of the FBI started with blind spots." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you, sir." Thomas stood. "And one more thing. Next time you stop someone, start with curiosity, not caution. It changes everything." Daniel stood too. "I will, sir." Thomas smiled. "Good. Because people remember how you make them feel long after they forget why you stopped them." He offered his hand once more. Daniel shook it firmly. As Thomas turned to leave, Daniel called after him. "Sir?" Thomas paused in the doorway. Daniel's voice was quiet. "Thank you for not embarrassing me." Thomas smiled over his shoulder. "The goal isn't to embarrass. It's to enlighten." Then he left, on no entourage, no lecture, no headline. Just calm footsteps fading down the hallway. That afternoon, Daniel sat at his desk with the notebook open in front of him. The first entry was dated 25 years ago, June 4th. "Thought I knew what guilt looked like. Realized I only knew what fear looked like." Lesson: learn the difference. Daniel read every line, every lesson scribbled in careful pen strokes, and for the first time in his young career, he realized how much power came not from enforcing law, but from understanding people. He closed the book gently, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling heavier, not because of shame, because of purpose. 3 months passed. Spring sunlight filtered through the blinds of the small-town police precinct, falling across desks stacked with files and empty coffee cups. The air smelled faintly of paper, leather, and brewing coffee. The quiet rhythm of a department starting another ordinary morning, but something was different now. Officer Daniel Hayes still arrived early every day, still wrote his reports neatly, still walked his patrol routes with precision, but the way he spoke moved, and noticed people had changed. He no longer started conversations with suspicion. He started with understanding. It began in small ways. He started saying good morning to every driver he stopped, no matter the reason. He asked questions before drawing conclusions. He even started mentoring 2 new recruits, reminding them that authority means responsibility, not control. At first, the other officers teased him for it. "You're quoting that director again," one joked. Daniel only smiled. "You'll understand when you meet him." And quietly, without announcements or posters or meetings, the tone of the whole department began to shift. Citizens who once avoided small talk with police now lingered to chat. Store owners offered water to patrol officers. Complaints went down. Respect, the real kind, the earned kind, began to replace tension. It was slow, but it was real. One day, the chief called Daniel into his office. "You've been making an impression," he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" The chief chuckled. "Depends who you ask. The community's happy. Some of the older guys say you're getting soft." Daniel smiled faintly. "Respect isn't soft, Chief." "I know," the chief said. "And so does someone else." He slid an envelope across the desk. It was embossed with the FBI seal. Daniel blinked. "From Director Reed?" The chief nodded. "He's coming next week. He's giving a leadership seminar at the Regional Training Center. He specifically asked for you to attend and to speak." "Me?" Daniel said, stunned. "Sir, I'm just a small-town cop." The chief leaned back. "Maybe, but small towns are where big lessons stick." The following week, the training hall was filled with officers from across the state, local sheriffs, state troopers, detectives, rookies. They filled the seats in quiet expectation, most unaware of what the seminar would be about. When Thomas Reed stepped onto the stage, the room rose instinctively. He thanked them with a nod and began speaking without notes. "Law enforcement," he said, "isn't a job of power. It's a job of trust. And trust starts not with policies but with people." He paused, scanning the room slowly. "I once met an officer who reminded me of myself. Eager, capable, but too quick to assume. We spoke, we learned from each other, and what I saw afterward gave me hope." He gestured toward the front row. "Officer Hayes, will you join me?" Daniel froze. The chief nudged him forward. As he walked onto the stage, a ripple of curiosity spread through the room. Thomas extended his hand. Officer Hayes didn't just listen. He changed how his department saw the community. "That's leadership." Daniel shook his hand, his voice steady but humble. "Thank you, sir," Thomas smiled. "Tell them what you told me last time we spoke." Daniel looked out at the rows of officers, took a breath and said, Every badge carries two weights, authority and empathy. Most people learn the first one in training. The second one takes humility. The room was silent. He continued, "When you stop someone, remember that you represent not just the law, but fairness. The way you speak might be the only thing standing between trust and fear. The director taught me that, and I've seen what happens when we live it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Beautifully said." Applause filled the hall. It wasn't loud or forced. It was genuine. For the rest of the seminar, Daniel sat beside Thomas as they discussed case studies, ethics, and community trust. Officers asked questions, some skeptical, some thoughtful. By the end of the day, more than a few left the room seeing their work a little differently. Afterward, in the quiet of the nearly empty auditorium, Thomas placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You spoke well," he said. "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied. "I just said what I've been learning." Thomas smiled faintly. "That's what makes it powerful." He paused, studying him for a moment. "You remind me of myself when I started, except you learned the lesson faster." Daniel laughed softly. "That's because you wrote it down," Thomas chuckled. "And because you listened." They stood together for a moment, the kind of silence that feels complete rather than empty. "Director Reed," Daniel said finally, "do you ever get tired of teaching this?" Thomas looked thoughtful. "No, because the world keeps giving us new people who need to hear it." A week later, back at the precinct, Daniel returned the old black notebook to Thomas's courier with a simple note inside. "I've read every page. The next entries are yours." Underneath, he signed his name, not just as officer, but as student. That evening, as Thomas read the note in his DC office, he smiled. He took out his pen and added a new line to the back page of the notebook. "April 12th. Thought I was teaching integrity. Turns out I was learning hope." He closed the notebook gently, the city lights reflecting across his desk. Some lessons, he thought, don't end. They continue in the people who carry them forward. And somewhere miles away, in a small town no one paid much attention to, one of those people was already doing exactly that. A year later, the little precinct in Fairfield County was nothing like the place it used to be. The same building, same cracked tile floors, same faded flag by the entrance, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Officers smiled more. Residents stopped by not out of fear or complaint, but to talk, to ask questions, to share coffee and stories. On a slow Friday morning, a local reporter stood outside interviewing townspeople for a feature titled, "The Small Department Changing Big Policing." "Something's different here," she said to an older man sitting on a bench nearby. He nodded. "Used to be, you saw a cruiser and you tensed up. Now you see one and you wave." Inside the station, Officer Daniel Hayes was finishing paperwork when the chief stepped out of his office, holding a letter. "Hayes," he said, "looks like someone's been paying attention." Daniel looked up. "Sir," the chief handed him the letter. It bore the Department of Justice seal. To Officer Daniel Hayes, "Your department has been selected to represent a new federal initiative on ethical leadership and community engagement. Your work has been cited by Director Thomas Reed himself as a model of trust-based policing. You are invited to Washington, D.C. to present your methods at the upcoming national conference." Daniel read the words twice, silent. "He remembered," he murmured. The chief smiled. "He doesn't forget the people who do things right." 2 weeks later, Daniel arrived in Washington. He wasn't used to marble floors or suits that cost more than a month's rent, but he walked through the halls of the Hoover Building with quiet steadiness. When he reached the briefing auditorium, Thomas Reed was already there. Same calm demeanor, same warm composure. "Officer Hayes," he said, standing to greet him. "It's good to see you again." "You too, sir," Daniel replied, shaking his hand firmly. Thomas gestured for him to sit. "I read your community engagement proposal. It's impressive." Daniel smiled modestly. "It's not complicated. We just started treating people like they mattered." "That," Thomas said softly, "is exactly what most complicated systems forget." He leaned back, studying him for a moment. "How's the department?" "Better than ever," Daniel said. "The young recruits, they lead with respect first. That notebook you lent me, I started one for them. Every officer keeps their own now. We call it the reflection log." Thomas raised an eyebrow, impressed. A reflection log? Daniel nodded. Every time we make a judgment call, a traffic stop, a dispute, anything, we write what we learned from it, not what went wrong. What we learned, Thomas smiled slowly. That's brilliant. It's simple, Daniel said. But it's working, Thomas chuckled softly. Simple is often the hardest thing to sustain. Later that afternoon, the conference began. The room was filled with officers from across the nation, seated under banners that read Integrity in Action. When Thomas stepped to the podium, he didn't start with data or strategy. I could talk to you about reforms, he began, but I'd rather talk about one officer who reformed himself, and by doing that, reformed a department. He turned toward Daniel, who sat in the front row. Officer Hayes, please join me. As Daniel walked up, the audience quieted. This man, Thomas said, taught his department something I've spent decades trying to teach on a national scale, that law enforcement doesn't begin with control. It begins with connection. Every respectful word, every calm decision, every moment of restraint builds trust. And trust is the backbone of justice. Applause filled the room. Daniel stepped to the microphone, his voice steady. I'm not a hero, he said. I made mistakes. I judged too quickly once, and someone showed me how to slow down. He glanced at Thomas. When you see people as suspects first, you'll always miss the truth. But when you start with respect, even the hardest days can turn into understanding. That's what I learned, and that's what I'll keep teaching. The room stood in applause, not for a speech, but for a truth that felt overdue. That evening, after the conference ended, Daniel and Thomas stood outside on the steps of the building. The sun was setting over the Capitol, washing the marble in gold. You did well, Thomas said. Better than you realize, Daniel smiled. Feels strange, sir. All of this started with a traffic stop, Thomas chuckled. That's where most lessons start, in the quiet, ordinary moments no one records. He looked out toward the horizon. What matters is that you didn't let the moment end there, Daniel nodded. Neither did you. They stood together in the soft glow of evening. Two men from different worlds, one who had once doubted, one who had once been doubted, now bound by understanding. Finally, Thomas extended his hand again. Keep leading with integrity, Officer Hayes, and keep teaching. Daniel shook his hand firmly. Always, sir. As Thomas walked down the steps toward his car, Daniel stayed for a moment, watching the city lights come on one by one. He thought of the first time he saw those flashing red and blue lights in his own mirror. The assumptions, the mistakes, the quiet lesson that followed. It had changed everything, not through punishment but through patience, not through authority but through empathy, and that, he thought, was how real change always begins, not from the top down, but from one human moment at a time.